Police arrested me for domestic violence after my husband showed them bruises on his arms. Only a month later did my neighbor confess she saw him hitting himself with a hammer in the garage before calling the cops. I never thought I'd be writing this post, but here I am at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, trying to make sense of the nightmare my life has become. 3 months ago, I was a normal woman living what I thought was a normal marriage. Today, I'm facing criminal charges and fighting for my freedom because of lies so elaborate they could be a movie plot. Started small like these things always do. My husband had been acting strange for weeks, more secretive, constantly on his phone, getting defensive when I asked simple questions about his day. I chalked it up to work stress. He'd been complaining about his job for months, saying his boss didn't appreciate him, that he deserved better. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the patterns. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner when he came home looking disheveled. There was a small cut on his forehead, and when I asked what happened, he said he'd bumped into a cabinet at work. I offered to clean it up, but he brushed me off, saying it was nothing. Later that night, I heard him in the bathroom for an unusually long time. When he came out, he seemed different, almost pleased about something, though he tried to hide it. Over the next few weeks, these minor injuries became more frequent. A bruise on his shoulder from carrying heavy boxes, a scratch on his neck from working in the yard, marks on his arms from moving furniture. Each time he had a reasonable explanation, and each time I believed him. Why wouldn't I? We'd been married for 8 years. I had no reason to doubt him. But then came the photos. I discovered them by accident when I borrowed his phone to call my sister. Mine was dead, and I needed to let her know I'd be late for lunch. As I scrolled through his contacts, I accidentally opened his photo gallery. What I saw made my blood run cold. Dozens of pictures of himself with various injuries, taken from different angles, some with timestamps showing they were taken over several weeks. The photos were organized in folders with dates and descriptions. When I confronted him about it, he exploded. Not in the way I'd ever seen him angry before. This was calculated, theatrical. He accused me of snooping, of not trusting him, of being controlling. Then he grabbed his own arm so hard I could see his knuckles turn white, and started screaming about how I was hurting him. I stepped back, confused and terrified, but he kept yelling, telling me to get away from him, to stop hitting him. I wasn't even close enough to touch him. That's when I realized what was happening, but it was too late. He'd already called 911. The police arrived within minutes. By the time they got there, he had fresh red marks on his arms and was crying, telling them I'd been abusing him for months. He showed them the photos on his phone, all those carefully documented injuries I'd thought were accidents. He told them I'd threatened to kill him if he ever reported me, that I controlled all the finances and wouldn't let him leave. I tried to explain, tried to tell them what I'd actually witnessed, but they weren't interested in my version. Here was a man with visible injuries and photographic evidence spanning weeks. And here was I, the accused abuser, with nothing but denials. They arrested me right there in my own living room, handcuffed me while my neighbors watched from their windows. The next 48 hours were the worst of my life. Jail is exactly as horrible as you'd imagine: the smell, the noise, the constant fear. I couldn't afford a good lawyer, so I got a public defender who seemed overwhelmed and distracted. She barely looked at my case before our first meeting and kept mixing up details with her other clients. When I finally got out on bail, I discovered my husband had already filed for a restraining order. I wasn't allowed back in my own house. All my belongings, my clothes, my important documents, everything was suddenly off limits. I had to stay with my sister, sleeping on her couch, trying to figure out how my life had imploded so completely. The restraining order hearing was a joke. He showed up with even more photos, including some I'd never seen before. He'd also brought witnesses, co-workers who testified that he'd come to work with suspicious injuries, that he'd seemed afraid when talking about me. Later, I found out he'd been setting this up for months, telling people at work that I was abusive, showing them his fake injuries, building a case against me piece by piece. What really got to me was how believable he was. Sitting there in court, watching him cry as he described the abuse he'd suffered, I almost believed him myself. He was that convincing. The judge granted a temporary restraining order and set a date for the full hearing in 30 days. Those 30 days were hell. I couldn't work properly. How do you concentrate on anything when you're facing criminal charges and the possibility of losing everything? I couldn't sleep, could barely eat. My sister was supportive, but I could see the strain it was putting on her family. Her husband started making comments about how long I'd be staying, and their kids were confused about why mommy was suddenly living with them. I spent every free moment trying to build my defense, but what defense do you have against fabricated evidence? I hired a private investigator with money I didn't have, but he couldn't find anything useful. My husband had been too careful, too thorough in his planning. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. Update. I can't believe I'm writing this, but things have taken a turn I never could have imagined. Remember how I mentioned my neighbor might have seen something? Well, it turns out she saw a lot more than I ever hoped. Mrs. Chun lives next door and has always been friendly but keeps to herself. She's one of those people who's always working in her garden, so she notices everything that happens on our street. A few days after my last post, she showed up at my sister's house looking nervous and guilty. She told me she'd been struggling with whether to come forward, because she didn't want to get involved in what she thought was a marital dispute. But after seeing the police at my house and realizing I'd been arrested, she couldn't stay quiet anymore. About 2 weeks before the incident that got me arrested, she'd been in her backyard pruning roses when she heard strange noises coming from our garage. She looked over the fence and saw my husband in there with a hammer, hitting himself in the arms and legs. At first, she thought he was having some kind of breakdown, but then she watched him take photos of the injuries with his phone. She saw him do this 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Always in the garage, always with different objects, the hammer, a wrench, even hitting himself against the workbench. Each time he'd photographed the results from multiple angles. The day I was arrested, she saw him go into the garage about 20 minutes before the police arrived. When they showed up, she watched from her window as he showed them fresh marks on his arms, marks she'd seen him create himself. Mrs. Chun had been too shocked and confused to know what to do with this information. She kept thinking she must have misunderstood what she was seeing. But when she realized I was facing serious charges, she knew she had to speak up. She'd also been documenting everything in her garden journal. She's meticulous about recording when she works in her yard. And she'd noted the dates and times of each incident. Her entries matched perfectly with the timestamps on the photos my husband had been taking. My lawyer was ecstatic when I brought Mrs. Chun to her office. Finally, we had a witness who could contradict his entire story. But we needed more evidence to make sure her testimony would be believed. That's when we got really lucky. Mrs. Chun mentioned that she'd installed a security camera system a few months ago, because there had been some break-ins in the neighborhood. The cameras covered part of her backyard and, crucially, had a view of our garage through the gap in the fence. We filed a motion to obtain the security footage, and when we reviewed it, we hit the jackpot. There was my husband, clear as day, repeatedly injuring himself while I was provably elsewhere. The timestamps on the footage matched exactly with the dates of the photos he'd been taking. But the most damning evidence came from the day I was arrested. The camera caught him going into the garage 23 minutes before the police arrived. It showed him hitting himself with what looked like a metal tool, taking photos, and then practicing his performance, literally rehearsing how he would act when the police came. When we presented this evidence to the prosecutor, they dropped all charges against me immediately. They were furious. No prosecutor wants to discover they've been building a case based on completely fabricated evidence. But that wasn't the end of it. My husband had committed multiple felonies, filing false police reports, perjury, fraud, and something called false imprisonment, because the restraining order had restricted my freedom based on lies. The confrontation happened when the police went to arrest him. I wasn't there. My lawyer advised me to stay away, but Mrs. Chun told me what she saw. When they showed up with the warrant, he initially tried to deny everything, but when they told him about the video evidence, he broke down completely. Apparently, he'd been planning this for months. He'd been researching domestic violence cases online, learning what evidence would be most convincing, figuring out how to make injuries look authentic without causing permanent damage. He'd even practiced his testimony in front of a mirror. The worst part was discovering his motivation. It wasn't just about getting me out of the house or taking control of our assets, though that was part of it. He'd been having an affair for over a year, and his girlfriend had been pressuring him to leave me. But he was afraid of losing half of everything in a divorce, so he'd concocted this elaborate scheme to make me look like the abuser. His plan was to get a restraining order, then use that as evidence in divorce proceedings to claim I was dangerous and unstable. He thought he could keep the house, most of our savings, and even get alimony by painting himself as a victim who needed financial support to recover from the trauma of abuse. The girlfriend had been in on it too. She'd been helping him plan the injuries, suggesting ways to make them look more realistic, even taking some of the photos when he couldn't get the angles right himself. They'd been texting about it constantly, and once the police got a warrant for his phone records, they found hundreds of messages coordinating the scheme. Update 2. It's been 3 months since my last update, and I feel like I'm living in a completely different world now. The legal proceedings have been a roller coaster, but justice is finally being served. My husband pled guilty to multiple felony charges as part of a plea agreement. He's serving 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. He also has to pay restitution for my legal costs, the money I lost being unable to work properly during this ordeal, and damages for emotional distress. The girlfriend got charged too as a co-conspirator. She received a shorter sentence, 6 months jail time and 2 years probation, but she also has to pay restitution. Apparently, she's been trying to contact me through mutual friends, claiming she was manipulated by him and didn't realize how serious the consequences would be. I have no interest in hearing her excuses. The divorce proceedings started immediately after the criminal charges were filed. With the evidence of his fraud and the fact that he was convicted of crimes committed against me during our marriage, I was able to get everything I wanted. I kept the house, most of our savings, and he has to pay me spousal support for the next 2 years. His criminal record also means he's unlikely to find decent employment, so that support might be theoretical, but the principle matters. What's been hardest to process is how long this was planned. During the investigation, they found evidence that he'd been setting this up for almost 8 months. He'd been taking photos of minor injuries and bruises from normal accidents and storing them as evidence. He'd been telling people at work that I was controlling and potentially violent. He'd even been researching my work schedule to make sure he could create injuries when I had alibis for being elsewhere. The most disturbing discovery was a notebook they found in his car with detailed plans written out like a project timeline. He'd mapped out exactly how he would escalate the fake abuse, when he would file for the restraining order, and how he would use it in divorce proceedings. There were even notes about how to act during court appearances and what emotions would be most convincing. Mrs. Chun has become an unexpected friend through all of this. She feels terrible that she didn't come forward sooner, but I keep telling her that her timing was perfect. If she'd said something earlier, before he'd actually gone through with calling the police, he might have just adjusted his plan. As it happened, she had concrete evidence of his deception that was impossible to deny. The security footage was so clear and damning that it's actually been used in training sessions for police officers in our county. My lawyer told me they're using it as an example of how domestic violence allegations can be fabricated, and why it's important to investigate thoroughly before making arrests. That brings up something that still bothers me: how quickly I was arrested based on his accusations. I understand that police have to take domestic violence reports seriously, but the complete lack of investigation before they put me in handcuffs was shocking. They didn't ask me any questions, didn't look for evidence that might contradict his story, didn't even seem to consider that he might be lying. My lawyer says this happens more often than people realize. False accusations of domestic violence are rare, but they do happen, and the system isn't well equipped to identify them. The assumption is that victims wouldn't lie about something so serious, but as my case shows, some people will lie about anything if they think it serves their purposes. I've been contacted by several advocacy groups who want to use my story to highlight this issue. There's apparently a growing problem with people using false domestic violence allegations as weapons in custody battles and divorce proceedings. It's a difficult topic because you don't want to make it harder for real victims to be believed, but you also can't ignore the fact that the system can be abused. The trauma from all of this has been harder to deal with than I expected. It's not just the betrayal or the fear I felt when I was arrested. It's the way it changed how I see the world. I used to trust people, used to assume that others were basically honest and decent. Now I find myself questioning everything, looking for hidden motives in innocent interactions. Dating feels impossible. How do you explain to someone new that your husband spent months systematically framing you for domestic violence? Even though I was completely vindicated, there's still a part of me that worries people will wonder if there's some truth to the accusations. The internet is forever, And even though all the charges were dropped, news stories about my arrest are still out there. My relationship with my family has been affected too. My sister was incredibly supportive throughout the ordeal, but I can tell it took a toll on her marriage. Having me live with them for months while dealing with legal drama created stress in their household. We're closer now in some ways, but there's also a distance that wasn't there before. Work has been another challenge. Even though my employer was understanding about the situation, having to take time off for court appearances and dealing with the stress affected my performance. I'm slowly getting back to normal, but it's taken months to feel confident and focused again. The house feels different now too. Even though I've redecorated and changed things around, I still sometimes think about him in the garage, methodically hurting himself while planning my destruction. I've considered selling and starting fresh somewhere else, but this is my home, and I refuse to let him take that away from me too. Final update. It's been a year since this nightmare began, and I wanted to give one final update on how everything has resolved. The biggest news is that my ex-husband tried to appeal his conviction, claiming he had ineffective counsel, and that the evidence against him was obtained illegally. The appeal was denied without even a hearing. The judge who reviewed it said the evidence was overwhelming, and that his conviction was entirely appropriate given the seriousness of his crimes. He's been transferred to state prison to serve out the remainder of his sentence after violating his probation. Apparently, he was caught trying to contact me through fake social media accounts, which was explicitly forbidden under the terms of his probation. He'd created multiple fake profiles and had been sending messages claiming he was sorry and wanted to explain his side of the story. I never responded to any of them, but I reported every contact to my lawyer and the probation officer. The violation hearing was swift and decisive. The judge wasn't interested in his excuses about how he just wanted to apologize and make amends. She pointed out that his continued attempts to contact me showed he still didn't understand the severity of what he'd done and wasn't taking responsibility for his actions. His girlfriend, meanwhile, has completely disappeared from social media and apparently moved to another state. Someone told me she lost her job when her employer found out about her involvement in the scheme. Good. Actions have consequences, and she was a willing participant in trying to destroy my life. The civil lawsuit I filed against both of them was settled out of court. I can't discuss the specific terms because of the confidentiality agreement, but I can say that the settlement was substantial enough to cover all my legal fees, lost wages, and provide compensation for the emotional distress I endured. My lawyer was thrilled with the outcome. More importantly, I've been working with a legal advocacy group to help other people who've been falsely accused of domestic violence. Turns out there are more cases like mine than I ever imagined. The tactics my ex-husband used, self-inflicted injuries, manufactured evidence, coordinated testimony from accomplices, are becoming more common as people learn how to game the system. We've been pushing for legislative changes that would require more thorough investigations before arrests are made in domestic violence cases. It's a delicate balance because you don't want to make it harder for real victims to get help, but there need to be safeguards against false accusations too. I've also been working with police departments to provide training on identifying potentially fabricated evidence. That security footage of my ex-husband hurting himself has become a valuable teaching tool. Officers are learning to look for inconsistencies in stories, to ask more detailed questions, and to consider the possibility that accusers might not always be telling the truth. On a personal level, I'm doing much better than I ever thought I would. The trust issues I was dealing with have improved significantly. I've been seeing someone new for the past 6 months, someone Mrs. Chun actually introduced me to. He's her nephew, and she vouched for his character completely. We're taking things slowly, but it feels healthy and normal in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He knows the whole story, of course. I decided early on that I wouldn't hide what happened from anyone I got serious about. His reaction told me everything I needed to know about his character. He was horrified by what my ex-husband had done, impressed by how I'd handled it, and supportive of my advocacy work. The house feels like home again. I ended up doing a major renovation, not because I was trying to erase memories, but because I wanted to make it completely mine. I added a beautiful garden in the backyard where I can see Mrs. Chun working in hers. We often chat over the fence about plants and life, and I'm grateful every day for her courage in coming forward. Mrs. Chun has become like a surrogate mother to me. My own parents live across the country, and having her nearby has been a blessing. She's proud of how I've turned this experience into something positive, and she's been telling everyone about the advocacy work I'm doing. Work is going well too. My employer has been incredibly supportive, and I've actually been promoted twice this year. Having gone through such a challenging experience and come out stronger has given me a confidence and resilience I didn't know I had. I'm better at handling difficult situations and standing up for myself. The most surprising outcome has been the relationships I've built with other survivors of false accusations. We have a support group that meets monthly, and it's incredible how therapeutic it is to talk with people who truly understand what you've been through. The isolation and self-doubt that comes with being falsely accused is unique, and having others who can relate to that experience has been invaluable. Looking back on everything, I sometimes wonder if I should be grateful for what happened. That sounds crazy, I know. But this experience showed me who I really am and what I'm capable of. I discovered reserves of strength I never knew I had. I learned to fight for myself in ways I'd never had to before. I found out who my real friends are and made new ones I never would have met otherwise. I also learned that the justice system, while imperfect, can work when you have good evidence and good representation. Mrs. Chen's footage and testimony were crucial, but it was also important that I had a lawyer who believed in me and fought hard for the truth. Most importantly, I learned that recovery is possible. A year ago, I felt like my life was over, like I'd never be able to trust anyone again or feel safe in my own home. Today, I'm happier and more confident than I've been in years. I have meaningful work, a supportive relationship, and a sense of purpose I never had before. If you're going through something similar, please know that it does get better. It takes time and it's not easy, but you can rebuild your life after something like this. Don't let the person who hurt you win by giving up on yourself or your future. The legal system caught up with my ex-husband and his accomplice. They're both paying the price for their crimes, and they'll have to live with the consequences of their choices for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, I'm moving forward stronger and wiser than before. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well.